His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July the 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house, and he said, "I swore to myself, that will never happen to me, and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house." And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home, and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert
Volker Eckert confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years, or for almost 32 years.
30 Jahre lang nicht geklärt worden.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he, of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me. So I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
Und dieses Mädchen
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
und dann auch töten.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat and started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck. And it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die...
Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide.
Es war ein Selbstmord.
Aber letzten Endes...
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
Und, ja.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, Her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
Sich das Leben genommen.
When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidtgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
He came from prison, guided by 2 policemen, into my offices. And then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also were very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Nordspanien, Katalonien. Dort hat die.
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
Tag lang herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, it panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house. It was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
For local journalists in Horf, the trial of this perverse killer, due to take place in the local courthouse, was set to be a huge story.
Ja, jede Schlagzeile ist gut für eine Zeitung und jede spektakuläre...
Every headline is good for a newspaper, and every spectacular story is good for a newspaper. And it isn't the newspaper's fault that it interests people.
Alles, was nicht normal ist...
But everything that isn't normal stirs people. And if someone living in a community finds out that the nice uncle was not actually the nice uncle that everyone thought he was, but a perverse serial killer, then that stirs people too. And then they want to know as much as possible about it. And we are there for the purpose of delivering that information.
Menschen auch, und dann wollen die möglichst viel darüber wissen und diese Information zu liefern, dafür sind wir da.
While waiting for his trial in custody, Eckert had lost the support of his family.
I remember very well he was very desperate that he had completely lost the contact to his family because his sister was always a very important point of contact for him through his whole life, and she didn't want to have contact with him.
Dann saß also in Bayreuth in dieser Justizvollzugsanstalt.
He was sitting inside his cell in the prison of Bayreuth and had a lot of time to think.
An seinem 48. Geburtstag.
On his 48th birthday, the 1st of July 2007, he knew that he would be officially charged with murder within the next few days.
Dass als Mörder angeklagt werden wird.
Nobody came to see him that day. His sister didn't visit, and neither did his brother.
Andere Familie, sein Bruder nicht.
It all became too much for him. On the night of his 48th birthday, July the 1st, 2007, Volker Eckert was left alone in his cell. The following morning, his body was found hanging from the bars. This killer's story begins in Italy in 1972. He was born in Sicily, and his family later moved to Potenza in southern Italy.
Potenza is a small Italian city, which is quite a way away from all the other cities, not just geographically, but also culturally. This is a city where the church is very influential. His family were amongst the great and good of Potenza, so he grew up in quite a privileged position. His family were quite powerful. His father was the director of the local branch of the National Library. He was quite an influential figure within the local community. If you would say his father's name, everybody would know who that was.
It was clear from a very young age that Restivo was different from other children in Potenza.
Well, Restivo, as a child, he had glasses, he was quite podgy. He's the kind of boy who would have been the target for bullies at school. He was the kind of boy who would never really fit in with his peers. But I think in those early days, he got a sense that I'm an outsider, I'm not one of this group, so I'm going to make up my own rules.
He was awkward as well in the way he talked to women, which is it's hard for you to try to talk to somebody when you look awkward and you act awkward.
Age 21, Restivo became obsessed with a young girl.
In 1993, he was a young guy, and it was clear he had an infatuation for a girl called Elisa Claps. Elisa Claps was 16, and she had said to friends that Restivo was becoming a bit of a problem, that he was chasing after her.
Elisa may have been irritated by Restivo's attention, but one Sunday she was willing to meet him at the local church.
She's a good, kind person. There are many stories of her going out of her way to help other people in the community. And I think she's somebody who feels quite sympathetic towards Restivo. She sees this lad who is an outcast, who's sort of picked on and bullied by the people. And I think she feels a sense of kind of care towards him. So when he asks whether she would come and meet him, she goes along with it because she doesn't for a million years think that his intentions are bad.
On a particular Sunday, she had arranged to meet up with him outside of the church in Potenza in order that she could say to him, look, I don't want a relationship with you. I don't want to go out with you, and can you leave me alone?
Elisa was seen going to meet Restivo in the church, but that was the last time she was ever seen alive.
When Restivo arrives in the UK, he is a very dangerous individual because he's never faced any consequences for his actions. He's in a country where nobody knows his history, nobody can join the dots together, so he really is like a kid in a sweet shop. He's got every opportunity to continue offending, and nobody really knows his background.
Restivo met an Italian woman on the internet, and he quickly moved in with her. They lived on a suburban street in Bournemouth.
She's an older woman, she has a disability, she's more of a mother figure to him, and she treats him as if he's a son, she looks after him, she cooks his meals. So he's stepping into his well-established role as this child in a different location.
Restivo's new home was opposite that of 48-year-old seamstress Heather Barnett. Just 6 months after moving in on the 6th of November 2002, he went to visit Heather. He claimed he wanted her to do some work for him.
And Mr. Restivo had been over and asked if she would make a set of curtains for him as a Christmas present for his then partner. And you think, well, that's a pretty strange Christmas present for a man to give a woman.
Restivo had been discussing the work with Heather. However, Restivo wasn't interested in curtains. Instead, he identified Heather as his next victim. On the 12th of November 2002, he paid his neighbour another visit.
They'd gone through to the back of the property, which was her room for doing her sewing and seamstress type work. And from there, it appears that she tried to make an escape from the individual. Things were knocked over. She'd moved through into the lounge where he'd obviously caught hold of her, and he'd hit her several times with a hammer. Her skull was fractured, and she would have been dead in the lounge very shortly afterwards. From that point, she was dragged through the lounge, through the hallway, and into a bathroom.
Restivo had brutally murdered Heather in her own home. He then placed a lock of hair in her hand. Curiously, it was not Heather's hair. Restivo's callousness did not end there. He then mutilated Heather's body.
He cut the breasts off and placed them behind Heather's head. He also mutilated the rest of the body quite badly. This maybe would show that his obsession was not simply the hair, but possibly the cutting of hair and cutting itself. To cut someone's skin would possibly have also excited.
Restivo was released yet again without charge. To prove him guilty, the police needed to connect Restivo to the crime scene. Their hopes rested on the green towel with blood splatters that was found in Heather's hallway the day she was murdered. But to make the case against Restivo, they had a major hurdle to overcome.
The forensic technology and the forensic advances weren't there, but we kept going back to that green towel and saying, how can we develop or separate out that mixed profile? And it did take a number of years before forensic science advanced, and we were able to do that.
Police would finally connect Restivo directly to Heather's murder. But it would take the discovery of a body in Italy to bring this murderer to justice.
What lies behind Restivo's motivation to kill and mutilate women is a sense of power. So he does so in the most extreme way, in killing them and mutilating them and using their hair as something that he has that's part of them.
Police in Dorset had already found a connection between Restivo and several cases of women having had their hair cut off by a stranger in public. But it was a murder in Bournemouth in November of 2002 that was their primary focus. In 2008, police re-examined a blood-stained green towel that they had found in the house of murder victim, seamstress Heather Barnett. Critically, the towel had 2 different types of DNA on it.
It took some years for DNA analysis to progress to the stage where the material on the green towel, which we said Restivo had left at Heather Barnett's address, could be analysed and produce a profile which could be put forward as evidence.
Then in 2008, we find that magic solution, and it's that final bit of that jigsaw where scientists say, look, we can now separate out those two bits of DNA, we can now separate Heather's out, and we can identify whose DNA that is. And that DNA, that separated out from that towel, belongs to Danilo Restivo.
Finally, the investigators felt they had enough evidence to charge Restivo with the murder of Heather Barnett. To make certain, they also needed to tie Restivo to the murder of 16-year-old Elisa Claps back in Italy in 1993. But with no body found, all they had were their suspicions. Elisa was still classed as a missing person. Then, in March of 2010, a remarkable discovery was made that would seal the case and Restivo's fate.
At the stage when Restivo was first charged, Elisa Clapp's body had not in fact been found, and so we proceeded purely on the UK evidence. However, on the 17th of March 2010, Elisa's body was discovered in the loft in the church in Potenza, where it had been since she disappeared on the 12th of September 1993.
When Elisa's body was found in the church that Danilo and Elisa had met outside of and had been in, it was decided that myself and another officer would immediately fly over to Italy to try and work with the Italian police, because we wanted to look at the similarities between the murder scene of Elisa and our murder scene, because as far as we were concerned, Danilo Restivo had murdered both individuals. We were allowed to go down to Salerno, which is the main city near Potenza. We were allowed to see the videos, and we were allowed to speak to some of the scientists, and lo and behold, there were things like hair in Elisa's hand, the same as there were in Heather's case, and it started to make a bit more sense.
So Restivo's signature is quite evident in both cases. So both of the women have hair in their hands. Both of them have their trousers pulled down. So this is quite a distinct thing in itself. Here is a case where the offender has spent time with both of these victims. But the crucial difference for me is that whilst Elisa's body was hidden, Heather's body was displayed. He got to the point in his offending here where he's saying, hey, look at me. So this is somebody who's evolved over time, and it's really, really concerning. This is somebody who's not going to stop unless they're caught.
The UK police could not charge Restivo in relation to the murder of Elisa Claps, as the crime was committed in Italy and so out of their territory. But connecting Restivo to the murder of Elisa solidified their case in regard to the murder of Heather Barnett.
Even though he'd never been tried in Italy for that crime, we adduced all the evidence in relation to Elisa Clapp's murder in order to prove him guilty of Heather Barnett's murder.
Finally, in May 2011, Danilo Restivo went to court, charged with the murder.
Well, the Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield.
It's not the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, but it's plenty big enough for those of us that live here.
Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small. never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. You know, probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building.
The Gein's 150-acre farm was located on the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue. Ed rarely got to leave the property and socialize with other children.
His mother, Augusta, is a very domineering character indeed. She is a devout Christian and she has some very extreme ideas about sin and about morality. And she drums into her sons that they're not to socialise with anybody outside of the family because all of the people around them in the local town are sinners, they're evil, all the women are whores. And so she creates this very insular family environment where they're quite isolated from the rest of the community, and that has a really significant impact on them.
Gein seemed to have been very friendless. Whenever he would make some kind of friend, on those rare occasions when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation.
And Gein's relationship with his father was also far from perfect.
Well, the father, George, was an alcoholic. He appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment, but mostly the picture that emerges of George is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all three male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household.
As Ed entered adolescence, his life became even more insular.
He dropped out of school when he was around about 12 or 13 to work on the family's farm, and he was considered to be a bit of an oddball. He was quite a loner, and he enjoyed quite solitary pursuits, so he really quite liked reading and was quite a prolific reader. So he was somebody who didn't really fit in, but worked incredibly hard to keep the family farm going.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Worden.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Worden. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. Yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Worden in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, now, it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was absolutely, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. Somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.
As the search of the farmhouse progressed, officers found that the grotesque collection of body parts became even more disturbing.
Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother.
Gein's macabre collection had been acquired from the very same cemetery where his mother's body lay.
2 years after the death of his mother in 1947, he starts grave robbing. So he's going into a local burial ground, he's digging up bodies, and he's taking things from the bodies. Now, he's not taking jewellery or items of any value, he's actually taking body parts. It really is an absolute house of horrors. So what started off as an interest, which was confined to the pages of a book, has now become a reality behind the doors of this rather bizarre house. So what he's doing in a really grotesque way is trying to bring his mother back to life in some way, shape or form, because he was just so dependent upon her for a sense of his own identity.
And the search wasn't over yet. Officers would soon discover, inside a paper bag in Gein's home, the severed head of a woman who'd been missing from Plainfield for over 2 years.